Welcome back. Now it's my pleasure to present our next speaker, Derek Pullen. You are director and co-founder of SculpConsLtd, a London-based international conservation consultancy. But before that, you've been head of the sculpture conservation department at the Tate Gallery for over 25 years. We're very happy to have you here. And you will talk about working with Duchamp's large glass. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for inviting me here. In this talk, I'm going to use the story of the acquisition of the large glass and the fountain to illustrate a change in attitude towards replicas that happened over a period of about 40 years at the Tate Gallery. I worked there as a sculpture conservator in the later years and witnessed a gradual alteration in attitudes as it caught up with changes in artist practice and in the art market. I'll describe how Richard Hamilton's large glass came to be made and conserved, and how we restored a Duchamp fountain, and how replicas are now at the centre of a strategy for preserving the most vulnerable artworks. As we know, Duchamp began to make the bride stripped bare by her bachelors even, or the large glass, in New York in September 1915 and continued to work on it at intervals until he set out for a trip to Europe in February 1923, when he pronounced it unfinished. It had already been bought as a work in progress by Walter Arensberg, but on moving to Los Angeles, he sold it to Catherine Dreyer so that it could remain in New York and Duchamp could continue to work on it. The Arensbergs are also said to have feared that the large glass might be damaged in transit to California with them. And indeed it was shattered, presumably while returning from its first exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum in 1926. I say presumably because the damage was not discovered until the case was opened several years later. The work was eventually repaired by Duchamp himself, and after Dreyer's death, Duchamp, as one of her executors, ensured that it passed to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where it's likely to stay forevermore. I'll assume that most of the audience know of Richard Hamilton. He was a key British painter, printmaker, and teacher. Hamilton had already been an admirer and known Duchamp for some years, when in 1956 he suggested making a printed version of the green box. Duchamp's collection of facsimile notes on the large glass, which was indeed then published as a book in 1960. A few years later, Hamilton gave a lecture on the large glass at the Pasadena Museum of Art during the Duchamp exhibition there. And that's where, I believe for the first time, he saw Ulf Linde's version on show. Let's make sure. I'm not sure this is the first version, and I've no idea why they put the foliage behind it. This copy was made in 1961 for the Art in Motion exhibition. Perhaps inspired by Linde, Hamilton had the idea of making another replica, and this idea became a possibility when he was asked to organise a major retrospective of Duchamp's work for the Tate Gallery in the summer of 1966. As it was impossible to borrow the Philadelphia large glass because of its fragility, Hamilton decided that he'd like to make not a replica but a full-scale reconstruction if the costs could be met. Hamilton said that the Tate were going to pay for making the reconstruction and then keep it for its collection, but it quickly changed its mind. He was told that it was Tate policy not to show reproductions in its galleries, so at this point the proposed reconstruction was seen as a reproduction, a copy, not an artwork. The Tate later changed its mind again, but by then Hamilton had found a backer for his project, William Copley. He agreed to pay $5,000 to cover the cost of the materials, and at Hamilton's suggestion, he gave Duchamp a similar amount as a fee. Hamilton decided he would use the detailed documentation in the green box, with which he was obviously very familiar, to retrace the various stages which led up to the production of the original work. The reconstruction was made in the Fine Art Department of Newcastle University, where he was teaching at the time. Copley's money enabled a student assistant to go to Philadelphia and make photographic record, as well as match up colour samples of Duchamp's paints. Hamilton and his students made a full-size perspective drawing from the dimensions in the green box. And to produce this drawing, he had to make many other perspective studies. And we saw yesterday upstairs how you build up different perspectives. Tracings were made of the new perspectives, and these tracings, reversed, were attached to the front of the glass to give the positions of the lead wires that formed the drawing. The wires were simply bent into shape and laid on the glass, where they were cemented in place with mastic varnish, just as Duchamp said he had done. Hamilton consulted with Duchamp, and he gives a very affectionate account of Duchamp leading him to a Montparnasse hardware shop to buy reels of lead fuse wire. This was when Duchamp discovered that it had been Hamilton's intention to have the wires specially made by the university's metallurgy department. Duchamp thought this was a waste of effort, and when they could be bought off the shelf, as he had done. On the other hand, Duchamp was at first dismissive of Hamilton's use of silkscreen printing as a shortcut for making the oculist witnesses. To learn how to handle the materials, Hamilton repeated the two studies on glass that Duchamp himself had made. They were the glider and the 9 Malick moulds. He went on to make 2 test panels not previously done by Duchamp, a small panel of the sieves, where he experimented with dust build-up, and another of the oculist witnesses, which you see here. For the original oculist witnesses, Duchamp had traced the design onto a mirrored area of the lower glass. And this is where I'm sorry, I've got one page out of line. Duchamp traced the design onto a mirrored area of the lower glass panel already protected by paint, and then slowly and laboriously scraped away, leaving the reflective image. Hamilton drastically shortened the process by silkscreening the design in backing paint ink. The dried ink protected the silvered glass, allowing the exposed silver to be etched away with a dilute acid. Duchamp felt that the 2 studies of the sieves and the oculist witnesses were new, and though he may have disapproved of the new way of creating them, he suggested they were published in an edition of 50, signed jointly by Hamilton and himself. Hamilton was pleased with the result of his reconstruction. He had used the green box notes, as he said, to reconstruct procedures rather than imitate the effects of action, and he had thus compressed Duchamp's years of work into many fewer months. Hamilton recalled after finishing the project, mental effort was exerted only in the direction of detective work, deductions from signs marking a path to be followed. The creative anguish was erased from the trail. When Duchamp came to London for the opening of his exhibition, he agreed to sign the work and painted an inscription on the back of the coffee grinder. And I think you can read the inscription there. In carrying out this reconstruction of the large glass, Richard Hamilton deliberately avoided making a copy that showed the original's 50 years of aging and deterioration. Instead, he set out to make it as it was conceived, accepting that it would also change with time as paint and metal oxidized. He mounted the 2 glass panels in a modern frame using architectural aluminium components, and the gallery wall label read Duchamp Hamilton 1965-66. According to Hamilton, Copley then claimed ownership of the large glass, as he had indeed paid for its fabrication. He wouldn't sell it immediately to the Tate, but left it in London on loan until it was wanted in New York for an exhibition. Then he decided to keep it in his New York apartment. The Tate tried to buy it back in 1975. Copley offered the reconstruction for $50,000, about 10 times what he had paid Hamilton for the materials. Hamilton was annoyed and fell out with Copley. And then, when the sale fell through, he was blamed by the Tate for interfering. But it turned out there'd been a misunderstanding. After more negotiations, Copley gifted the work to the Tate with an insurance value of $100,000, and I guess this enabled him to claim a tax relief. Hamilton had reconstructed the large glass using the same raw materials as Duchamp, except for the glass. He chose toughened armour plate, similar to that used in jewellery shop windows and balustrades. But he was unlucky. On a warm summer night in June 1984, as a Tate warder was making night patrol of the galleries, he heard a strange noise coming from another room. He turned on the lights and saw the lower panel of the large glass shattering in front of him. A fine network of cracks was spreading out across the lower panel. It was expanding and bulging forwards towards him. A few fragments had dropped out from the source point of the cracking near the chocolate grinder, but the panel had held together, though in imminent danger of complete collapse. To secure the glass, Tate conservators faced the panel with layers of clear, sticky plastic, similar to that used to cover books. It was in an estimated 200,000 pieces, each a few millimetres square. And during the morning, as the gallery got warmer, approaching 30 degrees centigrade, the cracking continued to spread across the panel. And to secure the lower panel from disintegrating, work speeded up to face it up with the plastic as the bulging increased. Eventually, the panel was removed from the frame in more or less one piece. Here's another photo. Unfortunately, there are no photos that I know of the whole thing falling apart. Everyone was in quite a panic, you can imagine. In the Tate archives, the correspondence between Hamilton, the conservators, the Tate director, and the British government is interesting, as they searched for the cause of the damage. Hamilton felt it must have been carelessness or poor handling, while the conservators suspected the high temperatures in the gallery that summer. They had been arguing for several years that air conditioning was necessary for the care of the paintings. The director notified the government agency responsible for the maintenance of the building that a high-value artwork had been destroyed and that air conditioning must be a priority project. Unfortunately, his cause was somewhat undermined when the manufacturers declared that the fragmentation of the toughened glass panel was a 1 in a million chance event. They described it in a phrase that might have been invented for the occasion by Duchamp himself as spontaneous stress relief. The breakage was probably caused by impurities in the glass when it was manufactured 20 years earlier. The manufacturers had been aware that this sometimes happened and had long since tightened their quality control procedures. There's no way of detecting the minute impurities, so the upper panel remains to this day at risk of similar disintegration. There was no question but that the lower panel had to be restored or replaced. One idea was to transfer the lead from the shattered panel to the new sheet of glass. However, the lead had already been stretched by the bulging as the panel expanded, and the resin, paint, and mirrored elements couldn't be transferred anyway. In the end, we decided to remake the lower panel using the same well-documented techniques employed by Hamilton. I say we because by September 1984, I'd joined the Tate as their first sculpture conservator and had become a very junior member of a team led by painting conservators Roy Perry and Chris Holden. And this is Roy examining Hamilton's own test panel of the Malik moulds as part of our preparations. Roy and Chris later wrote up the whole procedure in a technical paper for the conservation community, and in truth they're much more qualified than I to give this part of the talk. My contribution relied on a lucky chance that as a student I'd made glass sculptures and knew the chemistry of the mirroring process. After we had screened the Oculus Witnesses design onto the new toughened glass, my colleagues took over the delicate task of securing the wire outlines, exactly matching the paints and sealing the lead foil backing in place over the paint. It took about 4 months to complete the work and reframe it. The piece of lead foil from the centre of the coffee grinder on which Duchamp had painted his approval of Hamilton's work was transferred to the new panel. Hamilton felt that it retained continuity and anyway referred as much to the unharmed upper panel as to the reconstructed lower panel. I suppose it's reconstructed lower panel. It was put back on display without at first mention of the damage. You've got both sides. When our reconstruction was completed, it looked decidedly new. The paint was fresh and the lead backing was shiny. Previously, by 1984, the colours of both panels had already changed, and the outer surface of the lead sheet was slightly corroded, with white smears of lead oxides. Now, however, the upper panel was 20 years older than the lower panel, and Hamilton was uneasy about this. He had expected and indeed wanted the reconstruction to age and take on a life of its own, but not at 20 years apart. He was a frequent visitor to the Tate, and in the following years there were regular reviews of the way the lower panel was aging. Although the paint reacted quite quickly to the exclusion of air and began turning grey in places, the lead didn't appear to be aging much at all. There was a feeling among curators and conservators that the appearance of the back of the work was not so noticeably different to be worth interfering, and surely the lead would begin to oxidise with time. Only after several years was it clear that this natural patination was not going to happen. As good conservators, we'd left the glass and the lead clean and free from fingerprints or any dirt. It had no contaminants with which to react or corrode, and it was now displayed in climate-controlled and pollution-filtered environment of the upgraded Tate galleries. And ironically, it was probably the example of the panel shattering that perhaps led to these improvements in environmental conditions. There was talk about painting the lead to simulate the lead corrosion products, but this was felt to be faking it. The main point of Hamilton's reconstruction and the Conservation Department's reconstruction had been to truthfully follow Duchamp's working method, not imitate its appearance. This patination issue was not going to go away, and I'll return to it at the end of my talk. Meanwhile, by the late 1990s, work at the Tate was much dominated by preparations for the opening of Tate Modern. There was much thought and debate about future displays of international modern art and considerable awareness of the gaps in the collection. Apart from the large glass and the coffee mill painting, there was no Duchamp representation. The Tate had been slow to acquire any of Schwartz's replicas of the ready-mades, perhaps because they were regarded as copies rather than original artworks. Other museums, including Moderna Museet and several others here, had not been so slow, and consequently there were thought to be relatively few Schwartz replicas left in private hands. That turned out not to be true. Of the ready-mades that were acquired by Tate around the turn of the century, I'm going to concentrate on Fountain. It's a nice example of how conservators and curators can work together. A collector contacted the Tate offering what was perhaps the last fountain we thought in private hands. It came with immaculate provenance. It was first bought from Schwartz by Duchamp friend and collector Mary Sisler, who loaned it to Hamilton's Tate exhibition. After her death, Sizzler's fountain was sold at auction to the current vendor. When offered for sale to the Tate in 1998, the fountain seemed like a straightforward purchase, but before it was shipped from Japan, we asked for detailed condition reports from both the owner and an independent conservator in Japan. The reports were excellent, saying that the fountain was in near perfect condition. Shortly afterwards, the fountain arrived at the Tate. It was in a beautiful silk brocade box, and it was sort of wrapped up like a Ming vase. It's quite a picture. There were parallel negotiations for several other Schwartz replicas and a valise. Along with the reconstruction of the large glass, the fountain would be the prize piece in Tate Modern's new Duchamp display. Now, the UK government charges the Tate trustees with final responsibility for acquisitions, and they in turn require all potential acquisitions to be examined by conservators before a purchase is completed or gift accepted. Purchase of a cracked or fake urinal was potentially a godsend to the British popular press, who never tired of reminding the British public that in 1972 the Tate had spent their tax money on a pile of bricks. We all expected this pre-acquisition condition check to be routine, given that the condition reports we'd already had were so good. However, the yellow glaze raised my suspicions. We x-rayed the fountain and found that the right wing was cracked. On the reverse, you could just make out, let's see if this works, across here, the trace of the crack, once you knew what you were looking for. There was no sign of the damage on the top surface, but this was because the damage had been heavily restored. On closer inspection, it seemed that the visible sculpture was thickly painted, but we couldn't figure out why the overpainting was so extensive and so thick. Was it hiding more damage? There was no way of determining what was happening under the yellowed layer of paint and varnish without removing that layer. The vendor believed he was selling a perfect object and was unlikely to let us remove the overpaint in case it showed that the glazed earthenware surface of the sculpture had been damaged. It could have been abraded or etched to provide a key for all the overpainting. Now, this would have been a pretty outrageous and over-the-top restoration, but then total overpainting already seemed way out of proportion to covering a small crack in one wing. If we found that the fountain's original surface had been stripped by an earlier restorer, then it would have become an unsaleable object. There were other buyers in the background and no scope for further negotiations on price. Tate was faced with a take-it-or-leave-it offer. In the end, it decided it couldn't wait for another opportunity that might never happen and decided to buy. It was hoping that if the hidden damage was worse than the X-rays suggested, it could still be restored in time for the Tate Modern opening that spring. This was a brave decision that showed surprising optimism and confidence and wasn't necessarily shared by the conservators. There were only a few months left for research and treatment before previews began at Tate Modern. The sculpture could still turn out to be an irredeemable wreck. So when we looked more closely at this urinal and began looking at others in the same edition in other collections, it became apparent that they were all painted. There was glazed ceramic underneath, but the original replica finish was white paint over a grey primer. Furthermore, while researching Mary Sizzler's archives at MoMA, New York, my colleague Jackie Heumann discovered the wing of the sculpture had been broken and twice restored during a loan to New Zealand after Hamilton's exhibition. As the Arensbergs knew 80 years earlier, most damages to artworks occur in transit or when they're being handled or packed, rarely while they're on display. Sadly, Hamilton's reconstruction is an exception to that rule. Confirmation that it had been substantially restored explained the extraordinary appearance of the urinal and freed us to investigate beneath the yellow surface. It certainly wasn't original, but we couldn't know if the original surface survived beneath it. Flavia Perugini, who is now a sculpture conservator in Boston, devised and carried out the most skillful part of the treatment to remove the overpaint. Flavia found that on top of the porcelain body there was a grey primer coat which itself was overlaid with the heavily pigmented white paint. Now, every conservation lecture requires at least one cross-section. Now, her cross-section showed the restoration work as many alternating layers of paint and varnish above a thick white base over the grey primer. And you can see it more clearly in the slide under ultraviolet light. These are all overpaint restoration layers, several of them. Then you have a thick layer of white paint and some grey primer, and then the body of the porcelain. The main problem was how to separate the layers of varnish and white overpainting from the original paint layer, which of course was also white, and also of similar solubility. That is, the same chemical solvents dissolved both the original and later restoration layers of paint. After weeks of testing different solvents and mixtures of solvents, time was running out, but Flavia hit on a technique that could be controlled by applying a solvent gel to a paint or varnish layer for no more than 100 seconds. The top layer was softened just enough to be rolled off with a cotton swab without disturbing the lower layers or the original white alkyd layer. Because there were several overpaint layers of various thicknesses, it was very hard to see when she had reached the original layer. But fortunately, as we've seen in cross-section, the paint layers fluoresce slightly differently in ultraviolet light, so the cleaning process could be painstakingly monitored to avoid accidental over-cleaning. I think you get the idea from looking at the slides there. The damaged wing needed the most work and had to be, again, much retouched. And this was actually the state of the damaged wing, and it's what we had feared might be the condition of the whole sculpture. But in fact, it was only that area where it had been heavily abraded during its first restoration. Even in the 1960s, it would have been unusual to completely repaint an artwork, but maybe as a replica, it was then thought okay. 30 years on, however, we conserve Schwartz's replica with the same care we would have applied to, say, a Rothko painting. With Duchamp's replicas and other artist exhibition copies or posthumous casts now in the Tate collection, attention turned to whether Tate should aim to preserve by replication other artworks that were disintegrating as their materials collapsed with age. And this is the Tate version of two cones. Philadelphia had one which disintegrated slightly earlier than ours. Particularly at risk was the large collection of plastic sculptures by Naum Gabo. And a research program was started which included a workshop in 2007 when legal, philosophical, ethical, and practical issues of replication were discussed with curators, artists, and conservators. One outcome was the production of two replicas of heavily deteriorated Gabo sculptures that were reconstructed very much along the lines of Hamilton's reconstruction of the large glass, following Gabo's templates and notes in the Tate's archives. Other Gabo sculptures were on a wish list for when the money is found to do them. Finally, even in his late 80s, Hamilton continued to badger the Tate to do something about the difference in appearance between the aged lead in his upper panel of the large glass and that of the conservator's still largely uncorroded lower panel. With major retrospective exhibitions planned for his 90th birthday approaching, it was decided to attempt to accelerate the aging process of the lower panel, and my last research project at the Tate was to devise a way of controlling a change in the natural appearance of the lead of the lower panel until it was more in line with that of the top panel. After much experimentation, we created a boxed enclosure in which the lead was exposed to controlled concentrations of weak acetic acid fumes, while the vulnerable signed lead panel, which was already naturally aged, was protected by a latex resist. And you can just see the latex being rolled off the signed panel down the bottom here. Hamilton saw it shortly before he died, and he seemed well satisfied. Thank you.